Hello and welcome back to the CakePHP 4 tutorial series. This is the second part, the quick tour of CakePHP. In this video, we will cover the basic file structure of CakePHP. We'll just be quickly going through the directory and talking about what the most important folders are and the most important files. We'll also be quickly touching on the CakePHP request cycle, which is at the heart of CakePHP and how you will be working with it. We will set up our database configuration. We will connect to that database. We will insert some tables and kind of configure everything so it's ready for us to work with. And we will also be creating our very first model. So let's get to it. In the last video, we were able to get this welcome screen and everything was kind of green except for this little part that said the database was not connected. So in this video, we are going to fix that particular problem. We are going to connect to our database and we will get this entire screen green, as they say. So in order to do that, the very first thing is to create a database. And I am using just phpMyAdmin with my MAMP localhost server, and I have just right here created a new database called the CMS_DB. That is the name of my database. That's all I have done, simply by pressing new and making a new database. There are currently no tables in this database, so we need some tables, but I will already assume that you have a basic understanding of MySQL databases and how that all works. So we're not going to sit here and manually enter every one. I simply have a script here with a lot of tables that will kind of insert everything for us. And this particular script will be in the description below. So you can just take that, copy it in, and paste it in. And this is actually from the official CakePHP documentation because we will be using the same database. So you can also find it in there. So I simply insert that into the SQL, I press go, and you can see everything is green, so it was able to create everything, and we can now also see that we have a total of 4 different tables in our database. So let's just quickly go through them. We'll start with articles, which is an articles table, and an article will have an ID. We also have a user ID, so we can have different users create different articles. There's a title, a slug, a body, a published, which is a tiny int, a boolean, so basically indicating whether or not this article should be published. We have when it was created and when it was modified. We also have tags, and tags, again, they have an ID and they just have a title. Then we have the article tags join table, which has an ID of both of these tables. And lastly, we have the users table, which consists of an ID, an email, password, and when they were created and modified. This is the quick rundown. We will talk more about these tables when we start to work with it. This is just kind of what we need to get started. So we'll just create every table right now so that we have the basic structure. And we can also get an idea of what this application can do. We will be able to have different users. We can create different tags and different articles, and we can join that together. So we have a lot of functionality between these 4 tables, and we actually cover a lot of the different use cases when you are developing your own CakePHP applications. So now that we have the tables, the database set up, we go back to the screen here, and of course this will still be red because it says that we are not able to connect to the database. It has nothing to do with the fact that we now have tables in there. I mean, we can't connect to the database itself. So in order to do that, we open up the project, and the project will look like this. If we just kind of zoom out a bit here, this is the directory structure. And the most important places is the config. In the config folder, this is where you have your configuration for your project. This is where we will connect to our database. We also have the source folder, which contains basically all our source files. This will be the code, the logic that we write for our applications. We will place our controllers in the controller folder. We will have models in the model folder. And there are different types of models. Basically, there's an entity model, which represents a single entity, a single row in the database. And then we have a table, which represents the entirety, the collection of models, the table, as you were to say. There's also a view, which, it's, as you might think, you would put your view files in here, but that's not really the case. They actually go into the templates, but we'll talk more about the relationship later when we get to it. And lastly, we also have the web root, where the CSS and the JavaScript can be placed. Now, all this will make more sense as we get to it, but I would just like to quickly mention how a request cycle works in CakePHP, because if you go into any URL, you type www.cms.com/index, then what would happen is that you would actually get routed through a controller method called index, and then you would be able to do some logic inside your controller, and you could do a lot of logic. You could you work with your models, go into your database, do all sorts of different stuff. And then after that's all done, you would get redirected down to a view file. So you have this very nice separation happening automatically, so you can use the model view controller design pattern without actually thinking about it. You actually get enforced to use it, so it provides a much better structure for your application. But again, that will all make more sense once we start using it. So right now, we just have to connect to our database. And we can do that if we go into the config folder. Now we have a file called app.php, and it has a lot of different configurations. But if you have a file called app_local.php, then that is actually the file that you want to work with, because what is happening is that the app local file will actually override everything in the app.php file. And that's because you can have different folders for your production and your live, your live environment and your local test environment. But right now we're just going to be going into the app local folder and connect to our database. So in order to connect to that database, you have to find the place called data sources. Now you can see this is basically just a giant array with different key values in it, and it returns this whole array. So we know that this is being used somewhere in the application. They are calling this file, and it is returning this giant array of configuration files, and then somewhere it reads the data sources, which is our database, and it'll get all the information from there in order to connect to the database. So that's how it works. So inside the data sources, we have another array, and we have the default one. This is the default the database that we want to connect to. So that's the one we want to change. The host is my local host. So I'm just going to leave that as is. There's one thing you have to be, or you have to take notice of, and that's the comment right here. Because luckily for us, CakePHP is actually filled with these comments, especially in the configuration files, that kind of explains to you what it is and how you should change it. So it's well worth reading those comments before you make a change. And here's a good example as to why. Because this line is actually commented out by default. Whoops. Because it uses the default port based on the driver selected. But the thing is that if you're on MAMP on a Mac, you use a different port. Now, in this case, it says it uses the 8889, but I use the 8888 port. That is my default port. And you can see this by the way that I access my project here in the browser. I go to localhost, and then I use the port 8888. So I need to uncomment this line and put the port in here in order for this to work. But if you're not using MAMP, if you're just using the default ports on a Windows or something, then it shouldn't matter to you, and you can just leave it commented out. After that, we need to put in the username, and my default is just root, and my password is also root, and then the name of the database, and that is, well, CMSDB. So I already had that inputted. And after that, you can just go ahead and save the file, go back to the browser, refresh the page, and we can now see that it says CakePHP was able to connect to the database. So that's really great. That means we have a whole through to the database. We are now ready to start working with it. Everything is green, everything is working. We have the right permissions, we have the right versions of PHP, and we can connect to the database. I mean, everything is just good to go. So once you can get this screen up and running, you are ready to proceed. If you have any problems connecting to the database, make sure everything is written correctly, that you have the right username and password, that you're on the right port. Just make sure everything in there is correct, and that you are doing it in the app local file. If you are doing it in the app.php file, which also has a data source somewhere, there we go, down here, then it will be replaced. And it also says it here, the values in app local will override any values set here. So just make sure you make your changes in the app local file. Okay, so now we are ready to start actually writing some code. Now we have installed the project, we've connected to the database, and we're ready to tackle on some code. And the first thing we're going to be making is actually a model. So we go into the source folder and into the model folder. And again, CakePHP has two different kinds of model: an entity and a table. An entity represents a single entity, a single row in a database, whereas a table is the collection, the entirety of entities, the entire table. And it's actually doing a lot of smart things by itself if you are strict to the CakePHP naming conventions, and that's actually really important. If we go into the database here, the way that we name our tables really matters. So for instance, your join tables, if you're joining articles and tags, which is a many-to-many relationship, and you need a join table, you need to write it like this. You have to call it articles tags, and you have to have one row called article ID and another one called tag ID. So by adhering to these naming conventions, you'll get a lot of functionality for free. So it's really important how you name stuff in CakePHP. Technically you can name it anything you want, but you will get a lot of free functionality by adhering to the naming conventions. Okay, so the first file we are going to be creating is actually a table file, and we will create it in the table folder. We will right click, we will make a new PHP class. This class we are going to be naming articles table. Now notice the naming convention here. This is a table class, so that's what we have at the end there, and this represents our articles table. So when I write articles table like this, I am basically creating a class to represent the articles, the articles table that we have right here. So that's very important. You couldn't just, name it my articles. That wouldn't work. You have to name it your table name and then table at the end. We press OK, and right now we just have a simple class with no functionality. So of course we have to extend another class, and that is the table from the Cake ORM, and we simply extend it like this. And if you don't like that structure, I don't, so I will use the cake. I actually think we can just take this, copy it up, and say use this, and then we can just extend it by writing table. I think it's a little cleaner because it just looks prettier, if you ask me. Okay. In here we just need a single function, and that is the initialize function. And of course we will get the autocomplete because we are extending from a table, so it knows what's going on here. And inside this folder, or sorry, this method, the initialize method, we will not do the parent initialize. We will simply say this add behavior timestamp. We'll just see it's available in PHP 7. Okay, so my PHP Storm is not updated to represent the fact that I am using PHP 7 because return type declarations is only available in that version, and my PHP Storm thinks I'm on an older version. So you can fix that by simply going into the configurations, and I'll do that later. But first, let's talk about what this is actually doing. Remember I said that this class represents the articles table, right? We have just one method here that we overwritten from the parent table class, and that's the initialize function. In this, we say this add behavior and then timestamp. What this does is that it will automatically populate the created and modified columns of our table. So if we go into here, we have the created and modified. These will automatically get populated. Just like that, we don't have to do anything at all about it. And that is a great behavior to have. And it can do this because we are adhering to the conventions, because we add this behavior, and it will know that whenever we create something in here, we'll fill this out, and whenever we edit a row, it'll fill this out. I know you could also do it by putting default values inside here, and sure, you can do that, and then you wouldn't have to do this, but this just goes to show how much magic there is in CakePHP if you know how to use it. So now that we have an articles table, we will also create an entity. And this is an entity for our articles. So we go into the entity folder and we create a new PHP class, and we name this one article. We say articles table in plural and article in a singular. So we create that, and this represents one particular article, right? One row in the database. And again, here we have to extend the entity from the CakeORM. And again, if you do not like this convention here, which I don't, put it up in a use, and then you can extend the entity there. We also just need to do one thing in here, and that is to write protected, there we go, accessible, which is an array. We have this all set to true. We have ID set to false, and we have the slug set to false. There we go. So the only thing we're doing in the articles table is that we are creating a single protected variable called accessible. What this does is that it will control how our properties, how our columns in the database can be mass assigned. That is all it is doing. It's essentially it's a security feature where we say that we can't go in and you just mass assign the ID and stuff. So this is a security thing to implement. And again, we'll elaborate on this much more once we get to use it. But this is actually all that we're going to make in this video. In the next part, we will make a controller and a view file so that we can interact with our model. But this is the setup, and I want to just kind of reiterate on what we've done. We've made the database, right? Well, let's just take the articles table right now first. Let's focus on that. We have the articles table. Inside CakePHP, we made an articles table class. And we added a specific behavior so that it will automatically fill out the timestamps of this or on this table on any operation made on the entire table. we also made the article entity so that we can't go in and do mass assignments on certain fields, so that we have a little more control over what can be done to our entities. Now, you could still work with your application if you deleted these, because again, we'll talk about that in the next part when we get to the controller and we get to use them. But essentially, let's say we did not have an article entity file here. We could still work with article entities because CakePHP would actually make one for us at runtime if we selected any data from the articles table. Then it will simply make a default article entity to represent the data in that table. But by making this, we will be able to alter it and to add our own custom method on stuff we can do to our entities. So if you don't need anything else than just basic read and write operations, 8 out of 10 times you don't need to do this. But if you want a little more functionality, you can include this. And for completeness sake, you can always include it whenever you're making a node table, so that you just have them, so it's easy for you to change down the line if you want to. But this will actually conclude this video. We've finished the setup, and I know CakePHP can be a bit heavy to set up, but if you really think about it, how many new projects do you actually make? Usually you will work on a few large projects for a long time. You're not making 10 different products or projects a day, so it doesn't really matter. We've also written a little bit of code, and we've seen how we can kind of take our database and put it into our code, how we can represent it in the code. In the next video, we're going to write a controller so that we use our entity and table models and actually interact with the database and get some functionality up and running. So that's when we're really going to start building this application. So thanks a lot for watching, and I hope to see you again next time.